You probably used to love squatting before you started dealing with your back pain, but now you're loading the bar with half the weight that you used to, second guessing every single rep, and just always waiting to feel that twinge in your back when you are squatting. And every time your back pain does flare up, you hear that little voice in the back of your head saying, maybe I should just stop. And if you've been to a doctor or physical therapist for help with your back pain, you've probably been told exactly that. Just stop squatting, take some rest from training, and just see how it goes. But the issue is you don't want to do that because you love training, you love lifting, and you don't just want to give up the squatting that you have been doing in order to solve your pain. And more importantly, it might not even be the right answer to overcoming your back pain and actually getting back to training. In most cases, this is what actually happens when you just avoid squatting or lifting altogether to solve your back pain. You take time off of squatting or lifting and you do this for a couple weeks or a couple months and you start to feel better because you're not doing the things that used to aggravate your back pain. So because you are feeling better, you decide that you're ready to get back to training, but you don't realize that your back has become detrained and it can no longer handle the type of squatting and training that it used to be able to handle. So when you do get back to lifting, it's way easier to overdo things and just flare up your back pain all over again. And then the cycle just keeps on repeating over time, making it easier and easier for your back pain to flare up and having you lift less and less over time. The real solution isn't just stopping squatting or giving up training altogether. It's finding a way to squat so you can still allow your back to heal and feel better in the long term. I've helped over 500 lifters overcome their own back pain and get back to full training without any limitations. And in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how we do that with the squat. But before we discuss how to actually modify your squatting around your back pain, we first need to talk about how much pain is okay to experience when you are training and rehabbing your back. In most cases, we want to avoid 0 out of 10 pain at all times, because if you always have no symptoms whatsoever, then you're probably just training so easily that you're not going to make progress in the long term, and it's going to take way longer to get to the end goal that you have for yourself. On the other hand, we also don't want to have too much pain. Definitely a 7 or 8 or above is way too much, and you're just going to continue irritating your back and drawing out the rehab process and potentially even making things worse. Really, the sweet spot for productive training and productive squat modification around a back injury is 3 to 4 out of 10 pain or less. If you can find a way to train or modify the squat to fall in this symptom range, then especially if it's not long lasting, if it resolves within a day or less after training, then you know that you're training hard enough and squatting hard enough to make progress, but not so hard that you're just going to overdo things and continue flaring up the back, and not so easily that you're just going to be spinning your wheels and not making progress in the right direction. The good news is that there are many ways to modify your squat training around your back pain so that you can train in this sweet spot range of symptoms. The 5 main training variables that we can modify to do this are volume, intensity, tempo, range of motion, and the variation of the squat that you're doing. And we're going to break down each of these variables next. The tempo is simply the speed at which you're doing different parts of each repetition. And modifying tempo is one of my favorite ways to help my clients train around back pain because it's a really great way to focus on movement mechanics, movement efficiency, and limit the loading on the bar. When we're talking about tempo, I usually write it as a 3-digit number as an XYZ. X is the duration or the length of the eccentric or lowering phase of the lift. The Y is the duration or the length of the pause at the bottom of the squat, and the Z is the duration or length of the concentric or lifting phase. We can also be very strategic when modifying tempo because slowing down either the eccentric or the concentric or adding pauses will, based upon which one you choose, affect how much you actually limit the load on the bar. As a general rule of thumb, just slowing down the concentric by itself is going to force the biggest reduction in load, whereas adding a pause in the bottom is going to force a moderate reduction in load, and just using a slow eccentric is going to force the lowest reduction in overall load. With this in mind, if you're having quite severe pain, then you can use something like a 4-2-2 tempo or a 3-3-3 tempo, where you're using slow eccentrics, a pause, and a slow concentric, because this is going to force you to use quite lower loads than you normally would for your lifting. On the other hand, if you're dealing with more moderate levels of pain, you can use something like a 5-3-0 or a 4-2-0 tempo, because this is going to use slow eccentrics and a pause, but a regular speed concentric, which is going to allow you to use a little bit heavier loads than the other options. And lastly, if you're just dealing with mild back pain, then implementing something like just a slow eccentric or just a pause in the bottom might be enough to limit the overall pain that you're having while still allowing you to squat effectively. The next variable that you can adjust is the range of motion. For most lifters who are dealing with back pain, the very bottom of the squat is going to be the most aggravating position on their backs because in that position, most people have the most amount of forward torso lean, which is going to place arguably the most amount of stress on the back. So what we can do instead is artificially reduce that range of motion temporarily and then build back up to it over time. Two of my favorite ways to do this are either using box squats or pin squats. For a lot of people who are dealing with this type of back pain where it's the most noticeable at the bottom, they can start with box or pin squats where they are quite far above parallel, and then slowly work down to just above parallel, and then at parallel, and then below parallel, and finally to full depth as their pain subsides. The next variable that we can play around with is simply changing up the variation of the squat. If you have the most pain with barbell back squatting, then you can try something like a front squat or a Zercher squat, both of which will, one, allow you to be a little bit more upright, which can feel a little bit better naturally, and also force you to use less loading, which will decrease the overall stress on the back. You can also try using unilateral variations like front foot or rear foot elevated split squats or different lunge variations, because these will allow you to still train the lower body musculature really hard while effectively reducing the load on the back in half, which can make it a lot more tolerable if you're dealing with back pain. The last two variables are simply volume and intensity, and these variables are pretty straightforward. Volume is simply the amount of squatting that you're doing in a single session or over the course of a training week. So if you find that higher volume squatting tends to flare up your back pain, all you have to do is reduce the number of sets that you're doing in a given session by 1 or 2, or reducing the overall number of squat sets throughout the week by 2 or more based on how bad your pain is. When it comes to intensity, there are basically two types of intensity. The first is the external intensity, which is the amount of weight on the bar or the percent one rep max. And the second is the internal intensity, which is how hard a given set is or how close it's taken to failure. Simply reducing that external intensity by 10 or 20% or adding a few more reps in the tank for any given squat set might be enough to reduce the amount of back pain they're having during squatting. It's also important to mention that a lot of the other modifications that we talked about, like using slower tempos, using pauses, or changing to front squats, Zercher squats, or other variations are really effective ways at reducing that overall external intensity, and that's often how they work to help reduce back pain as well. Now, one of the important things to talk about is that there's no black and white way that you should specifically modify your squat training based upon your level of pain. This is very much a educated guess scenario where you have to apply a little bit of reasoning and a little bit of trial and error to see what works best for you. If you're having more severe back pain, then you might want to play around with 2 or more variables and modify them a little bit more extensively. So you might want to try something like a 303 tempo box squat above parallel for higher reps, leaving a few more reps in the tank than you otherwise would. Whereas if you're dealing with less pain, then you might only have to modify 1, maybe 2 variables and not modify them as significantly as before. So switching to something like just a regular box squat, or maybe switching to just Zercher squats or front squats, and leaving the rep range and overall reps in reserve or RPE very similar to what you would normally do. Now, when you make these changes in an effort to reduce the back pain that you have with squatting, the overall goal is to get back to the type of squatting that you would normally do. So you start with the modification strategy that allows you to train with that 3 to 4 out of 10 pain or less, and gradually progress it over time, either by progressing the volume, the intensity, tempo, range of motion, or the variation, whichever one you decide to use, and progress it back to regular barbell squatting with the typical rep range, intensity, and volume that would typically be using for your training. To give you a little bit more of a concrete example on how to actually implement this, I'm going to go over the case study from my client John, who was a recreational powerlifter that worked with us to overcome his own back pain with squatting. Before deciding to work with us, he had been dealing with back pain for about 6 months, and it started off not too severe, but it progressed over time to the point where he could barely squat 135 or more without 6 out of 10 back pain. And for reference, his previous max was 405, so this was quite a big limitation for him. And this is the exact squat progression and modification strategy that we use to get him back to full pain-free squatting as he normally would. So in month 1, we used 303 tempo box squats above parallel for his main squat session. And later in the week, we did slower tempo rear foot elevated split squats to give him a second squat stimulus, but in a way that was even less intense than the box squatting earlier in the week. In month 2, everything had been going well, so we progressed to both squat exposures for him each week. For the first squat exposure, we progressed to a 500 tempo box squat 2 parallel, and for the second squat exposure, we just switched to rear foot elevated split squats with a regular tempo. Both of these changes allowed him to handle a little bit heavier loads than he did during month 1. In month 3, we got him back to full depth squatting without a box, but we used a 530 tempo to limit the loading, and for his second squat exposure, we switched to Zercher squats as a way to further limit the loading on that second instance. This trend continued into month 4, where we made his first squat exposure just a pause squat to full depth, and his second squat exposure was a front squat. And we chose a front squat because as a powerlifter, he had a lot more experience doing back squat, and he didn't really train the front squat too hard before, so his front squat was quite a bit weaker than his back squat was anyways. In month 5, this is where his training started to really look like his training prior to his injury, in that we used regular full back squat to full depth, and we built up to a top set of 5 with some lighter back offsets. And for his second squat exposure, we used pause squats with the same set and rep structure as the regular squats. And in month 6, he got back to just regular squatting as he was before his injury. The first squat exposure each week was a top double with some lighter back offsets, and he actually ended up really liking the front squats, so we used the front squats with a top double and lighter back offsets for his secondary squat each week. Back pain doesn't have to just mean the end of squatting for you. It just means that you need a smarter approach, one that keeps you training, keeps you progressing, and actually gives your back a chance to not only get stronger, but also heal at the same time. If you want personalized help working through your own back pain, then click the link below to schedule a free consultation call with me and my team, because we'd love to see if we can help you out.